The P-51 Mustang was one of the most critically important fighters in World War II for the Allies. And its liquid-cooled V12 power plant, the V1650, a Packard-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin, was one of the most important aero engines for the Allies, if not the most important. The marriage of the P-51 airframe with the Merlin engine was a perfect match. That's the P-51 B, C and D variants. The Mustang without the Merlin, mostly the P-51A with its Allison engine, wasn't nearly as impressive, except at very low altitudes. But it was no match at high altitudes. The Merlin engine paired with other fighter airframes didn't quite achieve Mustang-level performance either. The Spitfire Mark IX, for example. It used a nearly identical engine, the Merlin 66, of which the Mustang's V1650-7 is a license-built version with the same horsepower. Yet, the P-51D was still a good 20 to 30 miles per hour faster at the same boost setting, varying with altitude. The P-51D achieved a maximum level speed of 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet and had a service ceiling of 41,900 feet. Perhaps more importantly, the Mustang had a range of over 1,000 miles, which more than doubled when using drop tanks. This extraordinary range and high speed was partially enabled by its low-drag laminar flow wing design. But something not often discussed and rarely given credit is the Mustang's thrust, what actually propels it through the air. The P-51 had 3 sources of thrust, and that's what I'll be covering in this video. Let's start with the first and most obvious one. Thrust provided by its V12 engine via the propeller. The Packard V1650-7 powered P-51D had a military rating of 1,490 horsepower at 3,000 RPM, which could be pushed to 1,720 horsepower for war emergency power by increasing boost. On any airplane, however, all that power is useless without a propeller to convert horsepower into thrust. The P-51D used a 4-bladed Hamilton standard hydraulic constant speed propeller with a diameter of 11 feet 2 inches or 3.4 meters. Actual thrust numbers are difficult to calculate, at least at my level of mathematical ability. The calculation requires various values: engine power, propeller diameter, number of blades, propeller RPM, efficiency factors, and a handful more. Now, I'm not going to attempt these calculations here, as I'm sure to make mistakes, but I did quite a lot of digging looking at calculations others have made and comparing them to tested thrust values of other World War II aircraft and engines. Although the results I've gathered through various means all varied somewhat, they centered around a number I'm comfortable sharing: 3,300 pounds force or 14.7 kilonewtons of total thrust created by the propeller. This should be treated as a rough estimate, and it represents static thrust, or thrust at very low airspeed. As airspeed increases toward cruise speed and beyond, propeller thrust drops significantly, as is typical of all propeller-driven aircraft. While the thrust provided by the propeller is by far the biggest contributor to the P-51's total thrust, it was not the only force pushing the Mustang through the air. Now we get to the more interesting sources of thrust, and this one is actually fairly well known, which is thrust provided by the Mustang's innovative Radiator system. Liquid-cooled inline engines in World War II allowed for much smaller cross-sectioned engines than air-cooled radials, generally allowing for more streamlined fuselage designs. But liquid-cooled engines need radiators to allow incoming air to cool the coolant, which in turn cools the engine, and these radiators create substantial drag. This was compensated for in various ways, especially around World War II, a topic for another video, But one approach was to use the Meredith effect, using the radiator to create thrust to offset some of its drag. Let's look at it in more detail. The Merlin-powered P-51's radiator was housed partially tucked away inside the fuselage, below and behind the wing. Intake air enters through a relatively small inlet scoop at the front. Inside, the duct widens. This is called a divergent duct or diffuser. For the intake air to fill this larger space while maintaining mass flow, the air spreads out and velocity decreases. At the same time, as stated by Bernoulli's principle, when air velocity decreases, static pressure increases. This slows down air before it passes through the radiator, and we know that drag increases with the square of airspeed, so this lowers the radiator's drag. Intake air is then further compressed when it rams against the radiator, since it cannot pass through the radiator fins instantly. Air gets back up against the radiators, which then further increases static air pressure. As the pressurized air moves through the hot radiator, the air gets heated. Heated air's density decreases and volume increases. This is thermal expansion. The rear of the duct has a flap behind the radiators which closes during high-speed flight. This makes the rear of the duct convergent, meaning it narrows toward the exit, the opposite of the divergent inlet. For air to maintain constant mass flow through a narrowing duct, air velocity must increase. This is similar to partially blocking a garden hose with your thumb, which squirts the water out faster. The same principle applies to air at these speeds. So as the hot energized air expands, it accelerates outward faster than the free stream air the plane is flying through. Air accelerated rearward means the equal and opposite force of that action pushes the plane forward. In other words, it creates thrust. If this all sounds slightly familiar, it's because it is. This is textbook Brayton cycle, which describes how a jet engine produces thrust. The open Brayton cycle has 3 phases. The first phase is compression. With the Mustang, it happens as air enters the divergent duct and rams against the radiator. Check. The second phase is heat addition, which is done by the hot radiator heating the air as it passes through. Check. The third phase is expansion, happening behind the radiator when the heated air expands through the convergent rear of the duct. Check. Brayton cycle complete. So it operates like a primitive jet engine. Now, some things to keep in mind. If thrust created by the cooling system exceeds the drag created by the cooling system, it produces net thrust. If not, it produces net drag. So how much thrust does this create? And does it produce any net thrust? This is actually a hotly debated subject, with claims ranging from very high net thrust created on one end to claims that it didn't even produce much gross thrust on the other. As is usually the case, the truth lies somewhere in between. After trying to follow calculations made by others and reading research papers on the Meredith effect on the P-51, as well as much more recent tests, I believe the most accurate number for gross thrust created is around 300 pounds force or 1.3 kilonewton. For comparison, take an ME262 twin turbojet. Each engine produces a maximum of 8.8 kilonewtons of thrust. Clearly, the Mustang's radiator system didn't create turbojet levels of thrust. But keep in mind, the P-51 isn't burning any fuel doing this. It uses waste engine heat to add energy to cooling air. But how much of the 1.3 kilonewtons was net thrust? It was likely minimal, but I do think it created some net thrust under the right conditions, probably at maximum speed. Still, the Mustang's cooling system thrust shouldn't be downplayed at all. It's very, very cool. No pun intended. Of course, some will probably argue that since it created very little net thrust at best, how can I claim it was a second source of thrust on the Mustang? Here, we need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Yes, the Mustang's cooling system added drag, and in most scenarios created more drag than thrust. But the cooling system was going to be there anyway. They took a system that normally creates only drag, one needed for engine cooling, and designed it to offset most of that drag by creating, you guessed it, thrust. The P-51 wasn't the only World War II aircraft that made use of the Meredith effect, and it was certainly not the first. The Spitfire actually used it earlier. But the Mustang perhaps made the best use of it, and I don't think any other aircraft utilized it to create anything close to net thrust. For example, some effort was made to further decrease cooling drag on later Spitfires as well, I believe from the Mark 9 onward, but with radiators located under the wings, there simply wasn't enough room to create effective divergent-convergent ducts. The Merlin-powered Mustang's fuselage was designed from the start to make use of the Meredith effect, and that's why it made the best use of it. Even if it didn't create much net thrust, the massive drag reduction was instrumental in allowing the Mustang to achieve the speeds it did. Now, the Mustang had a third means of propulsion, this one perhaps even more contested. The third source of thrust propelling the Mustang through the air was created by gases exiting its exhaust stacks. The reason I said this one is contested is because many downplay it as insignificant, while others argue it was trading engine horsepower for exhaust thrust with no positive net effect. But if the exhaust gases exit faster than the free stream air, they create thrust. That's simplifying things a bit, but the question wasn't whether the exhaust created thrust, but how much and if it could be optimized. This actually received a respectable amount of research and consideration by engineers in World War II. Legendary Sir Stanley Hooker, famed for his work on superchargers at Rolls-Royce, specifically mentioned a gain in speed of between 5 to 10 miles per hour with their jet action exhaust manifolds on the Spitfire. Even 5 miles per hour is significant, especially when considering the lengths engineers went to for increases in engine performance with boost, water injection, increasing RPM, and even nitrous oxide. Hooker estimated the exhaust gas velocity of the Merlin at about 1,500 feet per second. That's over 1,000 miles per hour. Unfortunately, I don't know which version of the Merlin he was referring to. And it wasn't just theoretical research either. A NACA wartime report compared the maximum speed of the Spitfire with and without optimized stacks in 1942, and they measured an increased speed of 6 miles per hour with optimized exhaust stacks. Tests were done even earlier than that. In response to a report of a gain of 6 miles per hour at 325 miles per hour on a Curtiss XP40 with exhaust stacks optimized for thrust, Bort Sikorsky did a well-executed experiment in 1940. They didn't do a flight test, but tested the difference in total engine thrust on a test stand with and without special exhaust stacks. It was a 550 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R1340. Like that on a T6 Texan, and at full power it gave an 18% increase in thrust horsepower with separate exhaust stacks for each cylinder, all pointed rearward. This puts to rest any doubt about whether optimizing exhaust stacks could increase thrust. Extensive exhaust thrust testing was done during World War II, but one question never answered, as far as I can tell, is how much speed the Mustang gained with exhaust thrust alone. This is likely because neither North American nor Packard appear to have conducted optimization programs for exhaust thrust on the P-51. Likely because that had already been done by Rolls-Royce on the Merlin, and they already reached a point of diminishing returns with further development efforts. My best guess would be exhaust thrust added a few miles per hour to the Mustang's maximum level speed. So, no, the auxiliary thrust gained by the exhausts and radiator didn't turn the Mustang into a jet fighter. but it certainly played an often overlooked part in making it a legendary long-range escort fighter and contributed significantly to its high speeds. What do you think about the P-51's 3 sources of thrust? Whether you think it's fascinating or remain skeptical, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.